On April 5, 1909, the front page of the Arizona Gazette carried a story that, by all rights, should have fundamentally reoriented our understanding of North American history. The headline was bold, provocative, and seemingly grounded in the journalistic standards of the era. Explorations in Grand Canyon, mysteries of immense rich cavern being brought to light. The article featured a byline for a man named G.E. Kincaid, an explorer reportedly working under the auspices of the Smithsonian Institution. This was not a vague rumor or a piece of local folklore. It was presented as a detailed, verifiable, and monumental archaeological discovery. The report provided specific geographical coordinates, named the institutions involved, and described a subterranean complex so vast and culturally significant that it should have become a cornerstone of every history curriculum in the United States.
However, the aftermath of this publication followed a trajectory that has become all too familiar in the annals of suppressed history. The Smithsonian Institution issued a categorical denial, asserting that no such discovery had ever been made, and that G.E. Kincaid was essentially a phantom with no record of employment or affiliation. The official narrative quickly shifted to label the story a fabrication or a piece of yellow journalism. Yet the Arizona Gazette, a reputable publication of the time, stood by the story. And more importantly, the Hopi elders, the traditional keepers of the canyon's secrets, did not move to contradict the claims. Their silence was not a sign of ignorance, but a deliberate, multi-generational strategy of protection.
This silence is the true subject of inquiry. It is a specific, purposeful refusal to engage with the public record regarding the deep interior of the Grand Canyon. The Hopi do not claim to be unaware of what lies beneath the earth. On the contrary, they claim a profound and ancient knowledge. This knowledge, however, is deemed too significant and perhaps too dangerous to be shared with a culture that lacks the spiritual and historical context to respect it. What occurred in 1909 was a collision between this ancient silence and the loud, sensationalist machinery of modern media. When the Gazette published its account, it stripped the Hopi's sacred geography of its context and reframed it as an archaeological curiosity. To understand why the Hopi remained silent and why the Smithsonian moved so quickly to bury the story, we must look beyond the sensational headlines and examine the economic and political forces that shaped the American Southwest between 1850 and 1920. The 1909 article described a discovery that defied the conventional archaeological models of the time. Kincaid, acting as a government surveyor, claimed to have found a massive underground citadel on the north side of the canyon, approximately 42 miles up the Colorado River from El Tovar, the luxury hotel recently completed by the Santa Fe Railway. The entrance was situated in a sheer cliff face, hundreds of feet above the river's churning waters, making it accessible only by the most precarious means. Once inside, Kincaid described a marvel of engineering. Passages arranged with geometric precision, radiating in cardinal directions from a central hub. He spoke of a main corridor that extended hundreds of feet into the living rock, flanked by chambers filled with artifacts that seemed entirely out of place in the American West. According to Kincaid's account, the statuary found within the complex bore a distinctly Asian character, while other artifacts, including copper tools and tablets inscribed with hieroglyphic markings, reminded him of Egyptian ceremonial objects. Most striking were the mummies, discovered in a seated position within niches carved directly into the cavern walls, wrapped in a dark, durable fabric. Kincaid estimated that the complex was the work of a civilization with immense organizational and engineering capacity, noting the uniformity of the architecture and the fact that the inner chambers remained dry and untouched by the periodic flooding of the canyon. The Smithsonian's immediate and total denial of these claims must be viewed through the lens of the institution's role in the early 20th century. In 1909, the Smithsonian was not merely a museum, it was a federally funded entity operating during a period of aggressive westward expansion and indigenous dispossession. The federal government's primary objective in the Southwest was the acquisition and commodification of land. The Dawes Act of 1887 had already begun the process of breaking up tribal lands,
and the Hopi were facing a sustained assault on their traditional way of life, including the forced removal of children to boarding schools and the criminalization of their religious ceremonies. In such a volatile political climate, the discovery of a pre-Columbian civilization of this scale would have been a legal and economic disaster for the federal government. If a sophisticated, permanent civilization had occupied the Grand Canyon long before the arrival of Europeans, it would have established a continuity of occupation that could bolster indigenous land claims. The official record could not afford to acknowledge such a possibility. This is not a matter of a secret society hiding the truth for the sake of mystery. It is a matter of a federal institution protecting the economic and legal interests of its patron. This pattern of discovery, documentation, acquisition, and eventual disappearance is not an isolated incident. There are at least 35 documented cases across the United States where significant archaeological finds, those that challenged the empty wilderness narrative, were systematically erased from the public record. This institutional self-preservation explains the Smithsonian's behavior, but it does not explain the Hopi side of the story. To understand that, we must look at the Hopi relationship with the Colorado Plateau, a region they have inhabited for at least 2 millennia. Their oral traditions describe the world as a series of successive stages, and they identify the Grand Canyon as the site of the Sipapu, or Sipapuni, the place of emergence. In Hopi cosmology, the Sipapu is a physical location, a portal through which their ancestors transitioned from the previous world into this one. This site is traditionally located near the confluence of the Little Colorado and the main Colorado River, within the depths of the canyon. The Hopi are not casual about their sacred geography. Their traditions are maintained with a level of precision that has survived for centuries. When the 1909 article described a vast underground network in the same general vicinity as the Sipapu, it was describing something the Hopi already knew to exist. However, the Hopi distinction between public and private knowledge is sharp. While they might discuss the vertical emergence point of the Sipapu in general terms, they have consistently refused to discuss the horizontal passages, the network of tunnels that their traditions say connect various sacred sites across the landscape. This was not a wilderness to them. It was a structured, mapped, and intentionally maintained territory. The decision to keep these passages a secret was a strategic one. By the turn of the century, the Santa Fe Railway had reached the South Rim, and the Grand Canyon was being transformed into a product for consumption. Tourism brought revenue, but it also brought federal oversight. When Theodore Roosevelt declared the canyon a national monument in 1908, he did so using the language of preservation, but the structural reality was one of exclusion. National monument status placed the land under federal control, often at the expense of the indigenous people who lived there. The Havasupai, for instance, were progressively restricted from their ancestral lands within the canyon to make way for a pristine wilderness that tourists would pay to see. An unoccupied canyon was a marketable canyon. A canyon filled with the ruins of a complex, ancient civilization was a site of contested ownership. The Hopi elders understood this perfectly. They had witnessed the systematic dismantling of their society and knew that confirming the existence of the tunnels would only lead to further extraction and desecration. If they spoke, they would not be protecting their heritage. They would be handing it over to be commodified by the same people who were currently trying to erase their culture. Their silence was a shield, a way to keep the archive of their ancestors intact and out of the hands of those who would see it only as a curiosity or a financial asset. The physical evidence, or lack thereof, is often cited by skeptics as proof that the 1909 story was a hoax. However, the geographic reality of the Grand Canyon tells a different story. The canyon is an immense, nearly impenetrable labyrinth, 277 miles long and over a mile deep. To this day, less than 10% of its vast acreage has been subjected to any kind of systematic archaeological survey. Most investigations have focused on the easily accessible rim areas, or the trails frequented by tourists. The deep interior, the sheer cliff faces, and the remote river corridors remain largely unexplored by modern science. Every time a serious survey is conducted in the canyon, it reveals more evidence of human occupation than was previously expected. Archaeologists have found granaries, settlement sites, and agricultural terracing in locations so remote and difficult to reach that they defy current models of pre-contact life. The evidence consistently points toward a much more extensive and sophisticated human presence than the official narrative allows. Yet the assumption that the canyon was a largely empty wilderness remains the default position of the National Park Service and the Smithsonian.
The documentary record is equally telling. While researchers have been unable to find Kincaid's cave, they have also found significant gaps in the Smithsonian's archives from that period. Personnel records are missing, and certain sections of the institutional history remain closed to independent researchers. The economic incentives for this lack of transparency are clear. Between 1900 and 1930, the Grand Canyon became the centerpiece of a massive tourist industry. The Fred Harvey Company and the Santa Fe Railway built an empire on the South Rim, selling a specific version of the American West, one where the landscape was a natural wonder and its original inhabitants were a vanishing race that left only modest traces. Any evidence of a large-scale, technologically advanced civilization would have disrupted this profitable narrative. It would have raised uncomfortable questions about land rights and the legitimacy of federal seizures. The suppression of such evidence was not a grand conspiracy of men in dark rooms. It was a structural necessity for the institutions that managed the canyon's economic and political value. These institutions acted in their own self-interest, and their interest lay in maintaining the status quo. The ethnographic record, though fragmented, provides the most compelling support for the existence of the tunnels. Independent researchers have, over the decades, collected accounts from Hopi individuals that describe underground routes connecting the Sipapu to other sites across Arizona, Utah, and Nevada. These accounts are not uniform, which suggests they are not a manufactured myth, but are instead the echoes of a real physical infrastructure transmitted through oral tradition. The Hopi describe these passages as containing objects of immense ceremonial and historical importance, placed there by the ancestors to be preserved through times of great social and environmental upheaval. This practice of caching important cultural items in inaccessible places is well documented in the Southwest, but the Hopi version is unique in its scale and its connection to the canyon's deepest recesses. The prohibition on sharing this information with outsiders is absolute. As Hopi scholars have pointed out, to reveal these sites without the proper cultural context would be to invite their destruction. In a world defined by extraction, exposure is a death sentence for sacred sites. The 1909 article was a breach in this wall of silence. It provided enough detail to potentially lead expeditions to the site, which is why the Smithsonian's denial was so crucial. By labeling the story a hoax, the institution effectively neutralized the threat. The hoax label acted as a deterrent, ensuring that no serious academic or well-funded explorer would risk their reputation by investigating Kincaid's claims. The canyon was allowed to keep its secrets, and the federal government was allowed to keep its park. The economic history of the period provides the final piece of the puzzle. The years between 1890 and 1920 were a time of legalized theft. The management of historical knowledge was a tool of this dispossession. By controlling the narrative of the past, the federal government could control the resources of the present. The Smithsonian, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the railway companies were all part of the same machinery, and they all benefited from a history that minimized the complexity of indigenous civilizations. The Hopi elders, watching from the mesas, saw this machinery in action. They knew that a truth, acknowledged by the American government, was often just a prelude to a taking. They chose to let the hoax label stand. They chose the path of silence, because they understood that some things are more important than being believed by a culture that does not value your existence. They were protecting an archive that they believed would be needed in the future, a record of where they came from, and a map for where they might need to go. Today, the Grand Canyon remains a place of profound mystery. Despite its status as one of the most famous landmarks on Earth, it is still largely a terra incognita. The National Park Service continues to find new archaeological sites every year, Yet the deep cliffs of the North Wall, in the area described by Kincaid, remain uninvestigated. The permit system that governs archaeological work is a gatekeeper, ensuring that only research that fits within the established framework is allowed to proceed. The economic and political stakes are still high. A major discovery would still complicate the multi-million-dollar tourism industry and the delicate legal relationships between the government and tribal nations. The silence of the Hopi elders has endured for over a century, but it is not a static silence. Younger generations of Hopi scholars are beginning to find ways to talk about their history that do not compromise their sacred obligations. They are challenging the empty wilderness narrative and asserting their right to manage their own heritage. The legal landscape is shifting, albeit slowly, and there is a growing recognition that indigenous oral traditions are a valid and vital source of historical data. The 1909 article, for all its sensationalism, may have been a garbled reflection of a very real truth. The passages in the cliff face, the seated mummies, and the geometric corridors may still be there, hidden in the shadows of the canyon walls. They are waiting for a time when they can be understood not as a commodity or a curiosity, but as a testament to a history that is much older and much deeper than the one we have been told. The Hopi elders who refused to speak in 1909 made a profound calculation. They bet that the silence would preserve what the truth would destroy. In the end, the question is not just whether Kincaid's cave is real. The question is why we are so resistant to the possibility that it might be. Our history is a constructed narrative, built on the foundations of what we chose to remember and what we were forced to forget. The Grand Canyon is a physical manifestation of that narrative, a place of immense beauty that is also a place of immense erasure. The silence of the elders is a reminder that there are still parts of this land that have not been conquered, still secrets that have not been sold, and still a history that remains to be told on its own terms. As we look at the canyon today, we should consider what is missing from the view. We see the layers of rock, the play of light and shadow, and the vastness of the space. But we do not see the archives in the cliffs, or the maps in the minds of the people who have always called this place home. We are the inheritors of a managed record, a history that has been edited for our comfort and for the benefit of those who profit from our ignorance. The real exploration of the Grand Canyon has barely begun, and it will require more than just ropes and permits. It will require a willingness to listen to the silence and to respect the knowledge of those who have guarded it for so long. The story of the 1909 discovery is a crack in the facade of our official history. It is a glimpse into a world that was deemed too dangerous to acknowledge. Whether or not G.E. Kincaid ever set foot in those tunnels, the pattern of suppression and the strategy of silence are undeniable facts. They are the scaffolding upon which our understanding of the Southwest is built. To look behind that scaffolding is to see a different America, one that is older, more complex, and far more mysterious than the one we find in the textbooks. The story of the 1909 discovery is a crack in the facade of our official history. It is a glimpse into a world that was deemed too dangerous to acknowledge. Whether or not G.E. Kincaid ever set foot in those tunnels, the pattern of suppression and the strategy of silence are undeniable facts. They are the scaffolding upon which our understanding of the Southwest is built. To look behind that scaffolding is to see a different America, one that is older, more complex, and far more mysterious than the one we find in the textbooks. The Hopi elders knew that the time for revealing these truths had not yet come. They understood that a civilization that measures everything in dollars and cents is not a civilization that can be trusted with the sacred. They chose to wait. And as the decades pass, the canyon remains, its deep interior still holding the secrets of the Sipapu and the ancestors. The silence is still there, and within that silence, the truth remains intact, waiting for a world that is ready to hear it. We must also consider the role of the Arizona Gazette in this drama. In the early 20th century, newspapers were the primary source of information for a public hungry for news of the frontier.
The Gazette was not a tabloid. It was a paper of record for the growing city of Phoenix. For them to put a story like Kincaid's on the front page, they must have believed it had merit. The detail provided in the article, the mention of the great man or Buddha-like statue, the description of the granaries, and the sheer scale of the cavern suggests a source with first-hand knowledge of something extraordinary. If Kincaid was a fabrication, he was a remarkably well-informed one. The Smithsonian's denial, while effective, was also remarkably thin. They didn't just deny the cave, they denied the man. This is a classic tactic of institutional erasure. If you can make the witness disappear, the testimony disappears with him. But Kincaid's name appears in other contexts from the era, suggesting he was a real person engaged in exploration and surveying. The effort to turn him into a ghost is itself a piece of evidence. It shows the lengths to which the institution was willing to go to protect the narrative. The 35 cases mentioned earlier provide a broader context for this behavior. From the mound builders of the Mississippi Valley, whose sophisticated earthworks were often attributed to anyone but the ancestors of the Native Americans living there, to the mysterious stone structures of New England, there is a long history of American archaeology being used to serve political ends. The goal was always to justify the manifest destiny of the United States by portraying the continent as a vast, underutilized space with no significant history prior to European arrival. The Grand Canyon discovery was the ultimate threat to this ideology because of its sheer scale and its undeniable connection to a living indigenous culture. The economic reality of the 1909 era cannot be overstated. The Santa Fe Railway was not just a transportation company, it was a land developer and a political power. The hotels like El Tovar were the luxury resorts of their day, designed to bring the wealthy elite of the East Coast to the Wild West. These tourists didn't want to hear about complex indigenous civilizations and contested land rights. They wanted a romanticized version of the frontier. The railway and the Smithsonian were partners in this endeavor, creating a sanitized history that was safe for consumption. The Hopi, meanwhile, were fighting for their very survival. The federal government's policy of allotment was designed to break up communal tribal lands and turn Indians into individual property owners, a move that would make it easier for white settlers to acquire the surplus land. For the Hopi, whose entire social and religious structure is tied to the communal management of land, this was an existential threat. In this context, the preservation of their sacred sites was not just a religious duty, it was an act of political resistance. Every secret they kept was a piece of land they held onto. The Little Colorado River confluence, where the Sipapoo is said to be located, remains one of the most sacred and contested areas of the canyon. Even today, there are proposals for tramways and resorts in this area, projects that the Hopi and other tribes continue to fight with everything they have. The battle for the canyon is not over. It has just moved from the front pages of the 1909 Gazette to the courtrooms and environmental impact statements of the 21st century. The silence of the elders continues to be their most effective weapon. By refusing to turn their sacred sites into archaeological attractions, they keep them out of the reach of the developers. The technological sophistication described by Kincaid, the hieroglyphics, the copper tools, the geometric precision, is often dismissed as fringe or pseudo-archaeology. But we should ask ourselves why we find it so hard to believe that ancient people were capable of such things. Our modern bias often blinds us to the achievements of the past. We assume that because we have computers and satellites, we are the pinnacle of human development. But the people who built the Great Pyramids, the temples of Angkor Wat, and the cities of the Maya were clearly capable of engineering marvels that we are still trying to understand. Why should the Grand Canyon be any different? The canyon is a natural fortress. Its walls are a vertical library of the Earth's history, but they are also a hiding place. It is the perfect location for a civilization to retreat to in times of trouble. The Hopi traditions speak of the ant people, who took them underground during a time of great destruction. While this is often interpreted as a metaphor, The physical reality of the canyon suggests it could be a literal description of a survival strategy. The tunnels and caverns would have provided a stable environment, protected from the elements and from enemies. The 1909 article mentioned that the complex was found 42 miles upriver from El Tovar. This would place it in a particularly rugged and inaccessible part of the canyon, far from the modern tourist hubs. Even today, a trip to that area is a major undertaking, requiring specialized equipment and a permit from the National Park Service. It is not a place where a casual hiker is going to stumble upon a hidden entrance. The canyon keeps its secrets through the sheer difficulty of its terrain. The Smithsonian's role as the National Museum gives it an enormous amount of power over what we consider to be true. When they say something didn't happen, most people believe them. But institutions are made of people, and people have agendas. The directors of the Smithsonian in the early 1900s were men of their time, deeply invested in the racial and social hierarchies of the era. They were not disinterested seekers of truth. They were architects of the American identity. And that identity did not have room for an Egyptian-style citadel in the middle of Arizona. The Hopi elders who saw the Gazette article in 1909 probably weren't surprised by it. They might even have known G.E. Kincaid, or at least known of his presence in the canyon. But they also knew the world he represented. They knew that his discovery was just another form of claiming. To Kincaid, the cave was a mystery to be brought to light. To the Hopi, it was a home that had never been lost. The difference between those two perspectives is the difference between a tourist and a resident. As we move further into the 21st century, the tools of exploration are changing. Ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR, and high-resolution satellite imagery are making it possible to see through the earth and the trees. It is only a matter of time before someone, perhaps not a government agency, but an independent researcher, finds something in the canyon that cannot be denied. When that happens, the silence of the Hopi will be seen for what it truly was, a profound act of stewardship. The mummies found by Kincaid, wrapped in dark fabric and seated in niches, are a particularly haunting detail. They suggest a culture that honored its dead and had a complex understanding of the afterlife. This mirrors the Hopi belief that the spirits of the dead return to the canyon, to the Sipapu, to begin their journey into the next world. The canyon is not just a place of life, it is a place of transition. The presence of the ancestors is a living reality for the Hopi, not a matter of ancient history. The copper items mentioned in the article are also significant. The Southwest has rich deposits of copper, and indigenous people have been working with the metal for centuries. However, the level of craftsmanship described by Kincaid, tools and artifacts that rivaled those of the Old World, challenges the idea that North American metallurgy was primitive. Again, we see the pattern. Any evidence of advanced technology is suppressed because it contradicts the narrative of a Stone Age people who needed the civilizing influence of Europe. The tablets with hieroglyphic-style markings are perhaps the most controversial part of the story. If true, they would suggest a literate civilization with a written language, something that is officially not supposed to exist in pre-contact North America north of Mexico. But the Hopi have their own written language in the form of petroglyphs and ceremonial symbols, which carry deep layers of meaning. To an outsider like Kincaid, these might have looked like hieroglyphics. To a Hopi, they are a record of their history and their covenant with the land. The 1909 article was a flash of light in a dark room. It momentarily revealed a landscape that was far more crowded and complex than we were supposed to know. Then the light was turned off, and we were told we hadn't seen anything at all. But the memory of that light remains. It persists in the stories of the Hopi, in the missing files of the Smithsonian, and in the unanswered questions that still haunt the Grand Canyon. The 35 cases are a roadmap for anyone who wants to understand how history is managed. They show that the suppression of Kincaid's cave was not a fluke, but a standard operating procedure. Whether it's the giant skeletons found in the Ohio mounds or the strange artifacts pulled from the bottom of the Great Lakes, the response is always the same: deny, discredit, and disappear. The goal is to keep the official history clean, simple, and supportive of the powers that be. The Grand Canyon is too big to be fully controlled. It is a wilderness of the mind as much as a wilderness of the earth. The Hopi elders knew this. They knew that as long as they kept their silence, the canyon would remain a place of power. They understood that the most important truths are the ones that cannot be bought or sold, and they were willing to wait 100 years or 500 years for the rest of us to catch up.
The economic history of the American Southwest is a history of transformation. It's the story of how a sacred landscape was turned into a national park, a resource, and a destination. But the transformation is not complete. Beneath the surface, the old world still exists. The tunnels are still there. The mummies are still there. The Sipapu is still there. And the silence of the Hopi is still there, protecting the heart of the canyon from a world that is not yet ready to see it. We are living in a time of great disclosure. Information that was once hidden is now coming to light at an incredible pace. The official narratives are crumbling, and people are starting to ask the right questions. The story of the Grand Canyon tunnels is one of those questions. It's a question that challenges us to look deeper, to think more critically, and to listen more carefully to the voices that have been silenced. The Hopi elders who refused to speak in 1909 were not just being stubborn, they were being wise. They knew that the truth is not something that belongs to everyone. It belongs to those who have the ears to hear it and the heart to respect it. They were waiting for us to grow up, to move past our obsession with discovery and ownership, and to begin to understand our place in the long, deep history of this land. The Grand Canyon is still holding its breath. The passages in the cliff face are still waiting, and the silence of the elders is still the most powerful story ever told about the American West. It's a story about the endurance of memory, the power of protection, and the ultimate triumph of the sacred over the commercial. It's a story that is still being written, one silent generation at a time. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and above all, stay informed. The truth is out there, but it's also down there in the dark, quiet heart of the canyon, where it has always been.